Thanks, Helen. Okay, so the idea for this work actually came about because I had a conversation a few years ago with a grower who asked me, how do I know when to change my greenhouse films? And I couldn't really answer the question. But at the time, I was doing a hort innovation project on protected cropping and pollination with respect to protected cropping, and I knew from that work that that pollinators are also affected by light quality. So I knew this was a question that needed to be answered. But I'm a plant physiologist, and so I needed to find someone to help me, and I found it in Dr. Richard Thomas, who is a physical chemist, and he's based at Western Sydney University. And he's really amazing, and he should really be here delivering these results to you, but he wasn't able to come. So I'm providing, I have to say, the dumbed down version of his presentation. But the results are really amazing, so I'm glad I'm here to share them with you. So I'm going to just talk about light quality in polytunnels with respect first to what plants need in terms of the light spectrum, and then talk about the survey we did of the different films that we collected. And then, hopefully I get time, to talk about how blueberries respond to the light received in polytunnels. So this is the light spectrum. I'm sure you've all seen the light spectrum. And what it shows here is the parts of the light spectrum that are important to plants. And PAR stands for photosynthetically active radiation. And you can see it goes from blue to the red part of the visible spectrum. So blue light and red light are important because, and actually I'm going to stop there and say, the green part of the spectrum is actually reflected by leaves. So leaves are like our solar panels. They collect the light spectrum in that range, but they reflect the green part of the spectrum, and our eyes detect that, which is why we see leaves as being green. And so that's the part of the spectrum they reject, so to speak, and don't absorb. Blue and red are really important for plants to absorb, because when these parts of the spectrum are absent, plants this elicits a shade response in plants. So what it signals to them is that there is shade, and they respond to this by getting leggy. They try and find the sun. They grow larger, wider leaves. They increase the concentration of chlorophyll in their leaves, and they look greener. So blue and red is important. UV is not photosynthetically active, but it does elicit a stress response in plants. And so, to give you the berry context, blueberries as they turn blue, and if there's UV present, this enhances the accumulation of the purple pigment, the blue-purple pigment in blueberries. It's called anthocyanins. And effectively, what anthocyanins are is a sunscreen for the berry. It takes that UV, absorbs the UV, it shifts it to a different energy level in order to avoid the damage from UV that can break down DNA and cells. So UV is important in terms of some bioactives we find in fruits and their accumulation. Far red is also an interesting one. When when red light is absent and its relative ratio to far red, that ratio is actually detected by plants, and that again elicits the shade response in plants. So the red to far red ratio is important. Okay, so that's our little bit of background on what plants need in terms of the light spectrum. So what we did was we did a survey of polytunnel films, and I have to thank my colleague at the local land services in Coffs Harbour on the mid-north coast of New South Wales, Harriet Brickhill. She coordinated collecting 20 different films from greenhouses and polytunnels. And so what we have is in this set of films, we have ones that we have new film, and then we have a range of different aged films from 1 year through to 12 years. And then Richard Thomas, he had another film that he collected from Western Sydney that was 15 years old. So we had a really good range of films in terms of what is out there on houses in the commercial world. So what Richard did was he looked at these films in different ways. The first technique he used was Fourier transformation infrared spectroscopy, and what it allowed him to do was look at the composition of the films, and the infrared, it basically detects whether bonds in the compounds are intact or whether they're broken. So that gives him an idea of how the integrity of the films over as they age. And the scanning electron microscope and energy dispersive spectroscopy allowed him to look at the surface characteristics at 300,000 times magnification and the elements contained in those films. And then there was the most exciting bit of equipment, which was the light integrating sphere. And so that allowed him to look at the movement of light through the films and how well that light was transmitted and how well that light was scattered by the films. So this is a picture of a diagram of the light integrating sphere system. So there's a light source, which is a tungsten light source. The light's guided through a series of lenses, and then it reaches the film, which is attached to the integrating sphere. So it's literally a sphere. And depending on whether the exit door is open or closed, a detector will detect either how much light has been transmitted or how much light has been scattered. So with respect to transmission of light through those films into the sphere, the exit door is closed. So all of the light is captured, and the detector, which is attached to a spectroradiometer, spits out the numbers as to what parts of the light spectrum are present. And basically this is the result. So all of the films didn't transmit UV, which is to be expected for a greenhouse film, but all of the films transmitted the light spectrum as a new film. So what I'm saying is the new films had produced a pattern of the light spectrum that was similar to normal solar radiation, plus a bit of the far red, so not just the photosynthetically active radiation, but some of the far red radiation. And For all of the films, the transmission was excellent. So there was only some loss of transmittance in that very oldest film of 15 years old, which is a real surprise to me. So let's talk about the scattering. So this is the integrating sphere. The light source hits the film sample. It goes through, and the exit doors open, so the linear light exits the integrating sphere, and all light 2.5 degrees is captured above that. And so that's the measure of that's how scattered light is measured. So in terms of scattering, I'm just going to go back there. In terms of scattering, all of the films scattered 11% of that light that's transmitted through the films. Scattering is a really important characteristic of a film, because what it allows is that light to penetrate the canopy where we want our red and our blue light to go, so that our plants don't elicit a shade response. So 11% of that transmitted light is scattered, and there was only some loss of scattering in that 15-year-old film, which is really amazing. Okay, so when the films age, what happened? So this is a picture of the new film versus the 15-year-old film at high magnification, and you can see that there's basically what you're looking at there are dirt particles on that 15-year-old film. Okay. So what were the films made of? So together the FTIR and the scanning electron microscopy showed that the films are made up of two materials. Mostly they're made up of a polymer called polyethylene, and then small amounts of a filler. One of those was alumina trihydrate. And so these are known as these products and they were all similar, despite the fact that they were from different greenhouses, and they'd obviously been put on those greenhouses even in different decades. They were all high-density polyethylenes. A plastic bag that you take when you go to the supermarket to put your fruit in is an example of a low-density polyethylene, and as a contrast. And they're full of something called plasticizers, and it's the plasticizers that trap UV light and cause those light plastic bags to break down. So we're dealing with something on greenhouses that are very resistant to breaking down, and basically the only problem with them as they age is that they increase their propensity to attract water and dirt. So the main issue is that what happens in the most aged films, the bonds are broken at the surface within those molecules, and they create a charged surface. So it becomes polarised, and we know that water is a polarised molecule, so it will come and stick to those films. So those films look wet compared to a new film where the water rolls off. And so that characteristic over time means that you're not as easily able to clean that film because of this polarised charge on the film, and they're more likely to attract polarised dust particles and dirt. So what we haven't done with these film samples is to look at the impact of the dirt over time on the intensity of light going through. It's quite a difficult thing to do because we have to do it outside and light changes all the time, and so therefore you have to do lots and lots of measurements in order to make that assessment. But nonetheless, this work was really interesting, and in conclusion, it showed that all films, or in conclusion for the films, I've got one more slide to show after this, all films are high density polyethylene and they're fairly consistent from one film to the other that we tested. They exclude UV, but they allow the transmission of PAR, the photosynthetically active radiation, and that far red light. We showed that in addition to that, film scattering was preserved for all of the films up to about 10 years old, but the oldest films had some loss of scattering. And I might say these films, that scattering property is really important for avoiding shade in the canopy. If you contrast it with polycarbonate products, so those harder panels that are on some greenhouses, polycarbonate has no scattering properties whatsoever. So that's something to think about when you're choosing what to cover your greenhouse with. And of course, the older the films get, the more likely they are to accumulate dirt due to that charged polarised surface. Okay, lastly, I just wanted to talk about blueberries in polytunnels, because we've done a bit of work with this. And I guess one thing to think about when you're growing blueberries in tunnels is where you are in Australia. The further south you get, in winter, the sun tracks lower in the sky. And so in summer it's okay because that light hits the film at 90 degrees and not much light is reflected. But if you're hitting that polytunnel at a lower angle, then you're going to lose a lot more light. And what that means is you've got then less light in the polytunnel in winter, and you may have a deficit of, that means less red and blue light. And so some of the work we're starting to show is that where we're located on the central coast of New South Wales, we were able to detect a deficit of blue and red light by showing that the plants responded with increased growth and more, they had a less shade response, reduced shade response in winter compared to summer. So that's something we're interested in. But it suggests to us that you may be able to add blue and red light in winter and improve the crop response and that accumulation of the pigment in the fruit. Okay, so just to conclude, our polyethylene films in our survey performed really well for 10 years, and there was only some loss of transmission and scattering in the oldest film of 15 years. I've already mentioned the differences between the polyethylene, the high density polyethylene films and the polycarbonates, and we're continuing our research in this area and look forward to your feedback in that. Thank you. We do have time for one quick question, if anyone's got any questions. No, can I ask a quick question? Yeah. Have you done any work on the more UV open materials that are used on the tunnels? No. So where you have like a hay grove that opens and closes? Is that what? UV open plastics that are used? Oh, no, I haven't, but I would, yeah, that sounds good. Yep. All right, just before we go, and we'll give you another clap in a second before anyone leaves, we are heading out to lunch now, and it's a 1 hour lunch break. I do have a hot tip, if you've not already noticed, that the lower room, where the tray displays, that also has lunch service down there. And usually there's no line because everyone's up at the top. So if you want to get lunch quicker, go down there.
Also, during this lunch break, we do have demonstrations on the main stage in the main trade hall. We've got the botrytis demonstration with Lincoln Harper again, and Jodie Campbell's also there showing off her fruit quality assessments that she's been doing. So that's all I have to say. I just want to say another thank you to Sophie, particularly for the two presentations. Thank you.